Hello and welcome to this fourth out of 5 videos on Is the Bible Reliable? In the previous ones we've looked at the case against the Bible, we've looked at how the Bible reads and what's the evidence from the text itself about whether we can depend on it. In this video we're going to look at where the Bible has come from. Is this our English Bible that many people have in their homes? Not quite as many people read it. Is that the Bible? Is this the Bible? Well, you can get hold of both the New Testament and the Old Testament in the original language. The New Testament was written in Greek and the Old Testament written in Hebrew. So, where did they come from? What's happened in the process of both putting those texts together and then translating those into the Bible that we have now? How do we know that what we've got is what was originally written down? So there are three things that we're going to look at in this video. The first is where the text of the Bible came from in the first place, and what's the evidence that it's something we can rely on rather than something made up. If you have an event that happened, are you going to rely on the account written at the time of somebody who saw it, or an account written 100 years later by somebody who wasn't there and didn't know any of the people involved? You're more likely to rely on the account that's closest to the actual events. So what have we got in the Bible? Have we got something that's close to the actual events? The second thing we'll look at is whether we've got an accurate translation. There's a massive gap of time and culture and language between 2021, when we're recording this video, and the time when the Bible was written down. So how do we know that we've got it right? How do we know that we've understood those original languages and understood what they mean, and that what we've got in the Bible actually makes sense? And the third thing we'll look at is how the final text of the New Testament was put together, and the accusation that's made that the church left out some of the more awkward versions of the life of Jesus and suppressed things, and whether there's been some conspiracy to hide from us the real truth about Jesus by the way that the books of the Bible were selected. So let's dive in. So we're looking at where the Bible came from, the origins of the Bible. And the accusation is made, as we saw earlier, that the Bible itself was a bit kind of cobbled together. Thomas Jefferson, why does every US president feel they have to say something about the Bible? Anyway, here's what he said. The teachings of Jesus, he said, are mutilated, misstated, and unintelligible. So Jefferson believed that whatever Jesus might have said probably wasn't remembered right, wasn't written down right, and then was distorted as it was passed on. So he would argue, if he was around to argue it, that we can't actually find out what Jesus originally said. Though, of course, if you think there's a difference between what the Bible says and what Jesus originally said, then where's your evidence for what Jesus originally said if the Bible's the only evidence? You're making quite a big assumption that things have been changed. Anyway, enough of that. So the New Testament itself, where did the New Testament come from? When was it actually written down? Well, the New Testament arises in a culture, I'll just move my picture here, arises in a culture where word of mouth was very, very strong. Memory was very, very strong. The normal practice for stories and accounts was to pass it on by word of mouth within a culture where people remembered things, where people's memories were much, much more able than ours are, because we have other means of recording things and storing them in text and data and writing and that sort of thing. But these were written down in an oral culture. So the New Testament, the earliest dated document we have is probably Paul's letter to the Galatians in about 49 AD. So that's within 20 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And as you can see from the chart, most of Paul's letters, many of Paul's letters written in the 50s AD. The earliest Gospels written down in the late 50s AD, Mark, Matthew, possibly Luke. The stories about Jesus would have been shared again orally. Jesus' teachings, if you read it, they're very, very memorable. The Lord's Prayer, obviously, many of us can say from memory. The Beatitudes have a kind of rhyming pattern to them. Jesus taught in stories a lot of the time, which are very easy to remember and pass on. But as the original witnesses to the life of Jesus started to be executed for their faith, the early church decided that the things that they would pass on by word of mouth, that they needed to write them down in order to preserve them for future generations. So that's why the Gospels start to be written down at about this time rather than earlier. And you go through right to the writings of John, written in maybe the late 80s, early 90s AD. John lived to an old age, lived in exile on the island of Patmos, and was the last surviving member of the 12 disciples. So we know from research that these were when the New Testament documents were written. So many of them written within the lifetime, well, all of them written within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus personally, who met him, who walked around with him. So there would have been living witnesses around to correct anything that was wrong in those accounts. And there would have been a strong tradition of storytelling and passing things on by memory that allowed things to be preserved. There's a formula that you find sometimes in the New Testament where Paul, for example, says, I pass on to you what I received. And this was a verbal formula that people used to say, here is a body of teaching, here is a way of giving an account of something that I'm passing on to you word for word as I received it. That was one of the ways in which information, stories, history, genealogy, whatever, that it was all passed on. Because writing technology was fairly primitive, because most people couldn't read and write, this was the main way that people communicated and passed on information. So that's where the sort of dating of the New Testament documents works out. But how do we know what's actually in them? Because it's one thing to say, well, Paul wrote Galatians in 49 AD, but if the earliest copy we have of Paul's letter to the Galatians is 1,000 years later, how do we know this is what Paul originally wrote? Well, compare and contrast. Here's the dates that we have for other writings of a similar period. So Pliny the Younger, who I'm sure you all heard of, a historian, wrote about the same time as the New Testament. The earliest complete version that we've got of his history manuscript is 850 AD. That's a copy written in 850 AD. So the gap between that manuscript and Pliny's original writing is 750 years. And we only have about 7 copies dating from 850-ish AD. So there's not very many copies, and there's a massive gap in time between the earliest text we have and when the original was written. Go down the chart, it gets worse. Caesar's Gallic Wars, so Julius Caesar had an account written about his conquest of Gaul, modern-day France, and of Britain, which happened in the 1st century BC. And he had that all written down to sort of a bit of propaganda to burnish his reputation. That was written in the 1st century BC. The earliest complete manuscript we have of that is dated to 900 AD. That's 1,000 years after when Caesar wrote it down. And we only have about 10 copies of that. So the gap is massive. It's like having a copy dated today about the Norman invasion in 1066. And so that the earliest first-hand account we have of this invasion is a copy of a copy of a copy, and the document is actually dated to 2021. Anyway, you keep going down the chart, you see that for many of the ancient texts, we have a gap of 1,000 years plus between the earliest physical manuscript we have of these things and the originals. But Mark's Gospel, the New Testament, just one example, written maybe the late 50s, early 60s AD. The earliest complete version of Mark's Gospel we have is dated to 130 AD. So that's about 80 years after the original. And we have 5,000 ancient copies of Mark's Gospel, both full and partial texts. So if you compare the New Testament to pretty much every other historical document we have from the same time period, the earliest manuscripts we have, the evidence is much, much, much stronger for the New Testament documents than anything else. If you said that, well, because there's this gap of a few decades between the earliest manuscripts we've got and the actual writings, that invalidates them, you have to put a line through pretty much everything that we know about the history of the Roman and the Greek Empire. The earliest fragments that we have, sorry, I'll just go back one. The earliest fragment that we have of the New Testament is in a library in Manchester, the John Rylands Library. It's of John's Gospel, and it's dated to just after 100 AD. So John's Gospel written down possibly 80 or 90 AD. Here is a fragment, a manuscript from 20 years later. The picture was there in the first slide, so the thing, no. Yeah, So on the left in that slide, that's the bit of John's Gospel that you find in a library in Manchester. It's physically dated to about 110, 120 AD, within the lifetime of people who knew John and knew what he'd written down. So that's how far back the Bible records go compared to everything else. So in terms of the manuscript evidence, the New Testament is much, much more strongly evidenced than any other document of the time. We have physical manuscripts that go back to much, much closer to the actual events the New Testament describes, and we have way more of them. So that's quite startling and quite strong evidence that the text of the Bible that we have is the authentic one. And the other factor is that when you look at the texts themselves, there is much less variation. So here's a bit of Luke's Gospel. Bring it up. Compared to a guy called Euripides, who was a poet, a writer from a few centuries before Luke. And the bit circled at the bottom is the footnotes. These, when these things come to be translated, the scholars sit down with the various copies of that manuscript and they look at where the copies vary from each other. So the footnotes are all the variant readings, all the, well, this copy that we have in a library in Cairo says this, and this copy that we have in a library in Moscow says that, and they're compared to each other, and the different readings are given in the footnotes. If you look at the footnotes for Luke's Gospel, this is just one sample page, the variations are much, much smaller than they are in other ancient documents. Again, that shows a consistency in what we have, the evidence for the text of the Bible. So that's the New Testament, that we have lots and lots and lots of text, lots of manuscripts. They go back to much closer to the earliest documents, and they are much more consistent with each other. So with the New Testament documents that we've got, we can be pretty sure that they are direct copies of the originals, that they're consistent with the originals, and we have loads of versions to compare and contrast, so you can see if there's been any changes made. And again, the evidence is that very few changes have been made. What changes that have been made can be put down to copying errors, because many of the scriptures are copied. Somebody would be standing up at the front, somebody else would be writing them down, and you can put many of them copying errors down to you hear one thing and write it slightly differently, or you get a bit tired and put the wrong mark in the margin. So in terms of ancient literature, the New Testament is the gold standard for reliability. If we do away with that, we have to do away with everything else. What about the Old Testament text? Well, the Old Testament dates back to about 500 years before the New Testament, at the very least, 500 to 2,000 years before the New Testament. It's a time when writing was even rarer, and a time when writing technology was even more primitive. So that the various things that New Testament writers actually physically wrote on, many of those were not available to people in Old Testament times. And most of the writings that survive are chiseled into stone. Any kind of fabrics that were written on would have rotted away. Now, the Old Testament, as we'll see in the next video, is repeatedly backed up by archaeological findings. But what about the findings that we have in the writings that we've still got accessible to us? Well, this is the oldest fragment of Old Testament text that we've got. It's a thing called the Silver Scrolls, and it dates to 600 BC. That's over 2,500 years ago. It was found in a tiny little amulet in an archaeological dig in Jerusalem, and it's a fragment of the priestly blessing in Numbers. May the Lord bless you and watch over you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you his peace, etc. So that's the oldest bit of Old Testament writing that we have, but that dates to 1,000+ years after the original. So there's quite a big gap there, which obviously raises a massive question. Well, what happened in that gap? Has the text of the Old Testament been changed? Has bits been added? Bits been taken away? Can we rely on something where there's such a massive gap between the copies that we've got and when the originals were actually written? Well, the massive piece of evidence here is the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the, I'll just come back to that picture in a minute. In the 1940s, not so long ago, the earliest full text that we had of the Hebrew Old Testament, so it had been translated into Greek from Hebrew, and we had older texts, but the oldest Hebrew text of the Old Testament we had dated from about 1000 AD, the oldest manuscript. So the physical text of the Hebrew Bible, we had something dated to 1000 AD, which related to something from 1500 years earlier, which is a massive gap. And so obviously people raise questions, well, is this a reliable text given the gap back to Old Testament events? Then the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in some caves in the Judean desert. They were the collected writings of a Jewish sect which had lived in the desert, had written a whole lot of stuff down and hidden them in clay jars in caves in the arid desert of Judea. Now, because of the way that they've been stored, the Dead Sea Scrolls are incredibly well preserved. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents. About 40% of the documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls were Old Testament texts alongside letters and regulations and all sorts of other things for their community life. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find every Old Testament book except Esther. There is a full text of the prophet Isaiah, which if you go to Jerusalem, you can see it on display. So top left picture in that slide, that's the full text of Isaiah as found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a cave at the bottom, and that's what the scrolls actually look like. Imagine unraveling those and cleaning them. But here's the thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls are writings that were written down in the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. There is a community that was in the desert during that time from 100 BC to 100 AD, and these are their writings. So the scrolls date to approximately the time of Jesus. So that Isaiah text that you can see in the picture is 1,000 years closer to the original Old Testament than that earliest manuscript that we have. The Dead Sea Scrolls take us 1,000 years closer to the original document. And the amazing thing that in that 1,000 year period, comparing the Dead Sea Scrolls to the next earliest manuscript we had from 1,000 years later, fewer than 2% of the text is actually different. Most of that can be explained by copying errors, and no major doctrine is affected. So the fact that over 1,000 years, such a tiny amount of the text has changed shows that actually the way that the Hebrew scriptures were preserved is in a way that doesn't alter or amend them. It's great evidence that the manuscripts we have are actually pretty much the original ones as they were written down. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Bible has been passed down pretty much intact from the very first time it was written. So we've got a text that by any reasonable standard is pretty much unchanged from the beginning, with a fantastic amount of good quality evidence to back that claim up. But have we translated it properly? We might have an accurate text, but what do we do with this text given that we don't know what many of the words meant? There's a massive cultural gap, etc., etc. It's all very well having a New Testament written in 2,000-year-old Greek, but how do we know what the words meant? One problem with the New Testament was that the Greek of the Gospels, that scholars trying to translate it, well, all they had to go on was classical Greek. We only had texts in the sort of high Greek of the high culture of Athens and places like that. And the Greek of the New Testament was very different. There were a whole load of words in it that we didn't have anywhere else. So we had no idea how they were used, what really they meant. And out of the 5,500 words in the New Testament, up to about 100 years ago, nearly about 750 of those words were words we didn't have anywhere else, words that translators had no idea how to translate. About 15% of the New Testament couldn't be confidently translated. But around the turn of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, there were a whole lot of archaeological digs that found documents from the time of Jesus, letters, bills, correspondence, laws, and so on. And they found that it was written in a different Greek to the high Greek of high culture. It was written in the Greek of the street, the everyday Greek, Koine Greek is what it came to be known as. And it turns out that that's what the New Testament is written in. The New Testament is written in street language, not high culture language. And so they found all of these words that had been mysterious, they were all there in these letters and these bills and these different things from the street. And the number of words that couldn't be found dropped from 750 to 50. Tiny fraction of the New Testament text. Most of the unique words in the Greek New Testament were actually Aramaic words that somebody had rendered into Greek to make them sound the same, like Amen or Abba. So these discoveries gave us a new understanding of the Greek text itself. So, for example, Gehenna was reckoned to be a term for hell. But as people discovered, there was a place just outside Jerusalem. Get rid of that cartoon. There you go. That's what the Greek looks like. So you go on the left, Greek. That says mathetes in Greek transliteration, and that's the word they're translated as. So we discovered, through the discovery of all of these letters and bills and documents and so on, that pretty much all of the words in the New Testament could be translated, and we had ways of translating them accurately and knowing what they really meant. So, for example, Gehenna, which is one of the Greek terms you find in the New Testament, was reckoned to be a term for hell. And then they discovered that in Jerusalem, and these documents talked about a place called the Valley of Hinnom, Gay Hinnom, which is down in the bottom left of this picture. And the Valley of Hinnom was the rubbish tip for Jerusalem. That's where all the city trash got thrown. I think they put the corpses out there as well. There was a constantly smouldering fire, and it was infested with maggots. So Jesus talks about Gehenna. He talks about a place where the fire never dies, where the worms never die, and the fire is never quenched. He's talking about the Jerusalem rubbish tip, and that's what we discovered from those more recently discovered writings. Another thing we've discovered about culture, as archaeology finds these things, is that there was a tradition that Roman soldiers could make citizens of the countries they occupied carry their packs for 1 mile, but they weren't allowed to make them carry them for any further than that. So when Jesus says, if your enemy forces you to carry his pack for 1 mile, go the extra mile, that casts a whole new light on that saying, because it becomes an act of civil disobedience. As soon as you go beyond 1 mile with the soldier's pack, the soldier gets into trouble for making you carry it for too long. So if you get this picture of these disciples of Jesus scurrying off into the distance with a soldier running after them saying, "Give me back my bag, you're going to get me into trouble." So some of the understandings that we're getting from archaeology are backing up the sayings of Jesus, backing up the words of the New Testament, helping us to understand them in greater depth. One other thing that helped us translate the Bible was finding that it had been translated into other languages of the time, Coptic and Syriac and Latin, and seeing how Greek was translated into those languages by people in the first few centuries after Jesus, again helps translators to see how to translate it into English. So translators of the New Testament have got plenty to go on. There's plenty of other examples of how the words in the New Testament were used, so we can be pretty confident that the translation we've got in our modern day Bibles is an accurate rendering of what was in the earliest ones. If you're still working off the King James Bible from the 16th century, you might want to get a newer one, because some bits of that won't be quite as accurate. So we've got a book where the manuscripts go back to the original sources. We know that it's been translated accurately. The third and final issue we're going to look at is, what about the books that have been left out of the Bible? Because every now and again, somebody will publish a book saying, well, there's this suppressed gospel of somebody or other, and the early church left these out of the Bible because it was embarrassing to them, and really this is the true story of Jesus, not the ones that the Bible has reserved. And there's a number of ancient documents that have the title of gospel. There's a Gospel of Thomas, there's a Gospel of Peter, there's an Acts of Barnabas, and so on. And many of them claim to record the sayings and the acts of Jesus. But there are several problems with all of these documents. Firstly, the dating is all to the late 2nd century onwards, so 150 plus years after the life of Jesus. The New Testament documents we can all date to between 50 and 80 or 90 AD. These other Gospels date from 190 AD onwards. They're clearly written much, much later than the New Testament documents. Secondly, with heresies and different kind of weird adaptations of Christian teaching starting to circulate, kind of mutant viruses, as it were, church leaders started to compile lists of accepted texts that could be directly connected with the apostles and their writings and their witness to Jesus. And so even before many of these sort of new gospels turned up, you have lists of accepted writings being circulated. So in the early 2nd century, fairly soon after 100 AD, you have the 4 gospels being mentioned in the same breath: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And by the end of the 2nd century, you have full lists of genuine writings. They're finally sort of finalized in 367 AD, but there isn't really much difference between the list of 27 books that were finalized then and the lists that were circulating around 200 AD. There's clearly a challenge between lots of alternative gospels and writings that purported to be by the apostles and the real thing. So the church had to do a job of working out which ones were authentic and which ones weren't. So did they actually suppress documents that were authentic? Well, the interesting thing about these lists is that they're actually quite conservative. The lists were of sort of maybe 20, 25 books, and there were several of the books that we have in the Bible, like Revelation, 2 Peter, where there was a fierce debate in the early church about whether these were actually authentic biblical texts. It's not like there was a list of 40 or 50 books and then gradually they struck out the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of James, and got rid of the dodgy ones. They were never in the list to start with. They were never, ever contenders. And if you read them, you'll see why. So let's have a look at a fragment from Gospel of Thomas. So this is one of the ones that's frequently cited in books by people who claim to have discovered authentic Christianity. Here's just a bit from the Gospel of Thomas, which is it's a collection of sayings. It doesn't have any historical data. It doesn't have any geographical data. It just has various sayings of Jesus and his followers. So it isn't actually a gospel. Here's a reading from it. Simon Peter said to him, to Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Boo. Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, does that sound like Jesus to you? And to be honest, if it does sound like Jesus, then yeah, it's not a Jesus I particularly want to spend any more time with. Once you read these so-called Gospels, you discover that they are very, very different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the other recorded sayings of Jesus in the New Testament. And the way that Jesus comes across is, just plain weird in some of these examples. There's no question of them being suppressed or excluded. They exclude themselves. It's fairly obvious from reading them that these are not authentic accounts of Jesus. Somebody is putting words in Jesus' mouth to try and advance their own agenda. And there's plenty of stuff on the internet if you want to look more into those. But don't get spooked by these, new gospel discovered that disproves early Christianity. Those gospels were there, they were known about, they were in wide circulation. There were various cults and sects and mutant teachings circulating. And the early church, when you look at the alternative gospels, there's a very clear difference between the kind of Jesus they portray and the Jesus portrayed in the real texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there's no question of them being suppressed or excluded there. They were just never contenders in the first place. So we've looked at where we got the text of the Bible and the fact that our manuscripts go back to really, really close to the original events, they give us much more evidence than any other writings of the same period. We've seen how the Bible can be accurately translated, and we've seen how the Bible was put together, and how the books that we have in Scripture, we can be pretty sure that they are the right ones, and that there isn't anything there's no big conspiracy theory that's left out stuff that is really important and true. So in the next part, the final video of this series, we're going to look at archaeology. What have the historians, the archaeologists and the scientists discovered about Bible times, and does that tally with what the Bible tells us? Because that's a key bit of evidence. If the Bible talks about places that nobody ever knew about, if it invents events that never really happened, then that raises a big question over its reliability. But if what the Bible talks about, the people, the places, the events, if there's evidence for those in archaeology and historical sources outside the Bible, then that again is strong evidence that the Bible is a book we can rely on. So The link for that video, along with all the others, should be directly below this one on YouTube. Thanks very much for watching.